At the outset, I just want to make a few observations. We had considerable difficulty in securing Mr. Robbins to give evidence which is unacceptable to a select committee. We first put in our request on the 28th of February and invited him to come, but made no progress. I then raised the matter with the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's questions and then pressed him again for his appearance, which the Prime Minister declined. We had no option but then to issue a summons to secure a date, which is the basis on which he now appears, and the Prime Minister, I'm glad, has changed her mind on his giving evidence. The Secretary of State only took up his post on the 9th of July after Chequers, and therefore there will be questions which we will need to ask Mr. Robbins alone. He's been engaged in the negotiations as the Prime Minister's advisor on Europe since, I think, September 2017. Is that correct?
That's when I took up my current post, yes.
Thank you. The Secretary of State wrote to me on the 23rd of August, referring to the Prime Minister's written ministerial statement of the 24th of July, in which she stated that she was in charge of the negotiations and that he, as Secretary of State, deputises and answers for her. I'm glad to note the Secretary of State recognises, as he states in his letter to us, that the long-standing role of this committee in holding the government to account is well understood by the government. So I'll now start with the first question of what will be possibly a 2-hour session. Mr. Robbins, coming to you first as the Prime Minister's Europe Advisor, Permanent Secretary and Architect of Chequers, which was bounced on the Cabinet. Mr. Barnier, it is reported by VAZ, the German newspaper, has indicated that the Chequers proposals were insane and unjustifiably breaking European law and illegal in that context. And he refers clearly to such matters as the Common Rule Book. It is clearly understood, of course, that they do fragment the legal principles of the single market under the EU treaties. There is also today's criticism from the former Governor of the Bank of England. Furthermore, the Common Rule Book and changes to it will be decided by the other 27 EU countries behind closed doors and without even a transcript of the proceedings. Would you therefore advise the Prime Minister to put Chequers out of its misery, as it is now effectively dead and satisfies virtually no one?
Thank you, Chairman. No, I wouldn't. I mean, that's a matter for ministers collectively. The proposals that were published in the White Paper before the summer are the government's collective position. The Secretary of State and I have been prosecuting that position with the European Commission and other interlocutors since his appointment and since the publication of the White Paper. Respectfully, we disagree with Mr. Barnier, and the government's view is that the proposals encapsulated in the White Paper are a credible, sensible balance of trying to achieve something that respects the autonomy of the EU and the sovereignty of the UK, and provides for a pragmatic future relationship with the EU.
I ought just to add that that idea that you can respect the autonomy of the EU and the sovereignty of the UK seems to me to be completely impossible, because you can't achieve both of those things at the same time. But I'll pass on to the next question I want to ask you.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
I'd just supplement, because ultimately you're asking a political question as well as a technical one. Just to say gently, I think in relation to the interview that you've cited, you've missed out some of the good bits. And I know you wouldn't want to be selective or cherry-pick from the EU in the same way that they complain about us. And actually, Mr. Barnier, in the same interview, said that the withdrawal agreement is 80% negotiated. We are close to our goal. In relation to the security aspects, he said there's a great deal of agreement on foreign and security policy as well as in internal security. And of course, on the 27th of August, he said we're prepared to offer Britain partnership such as there has never been with any other third country. Of course, you're quite right to cite the bits that he has grumbled about. I suspect if you looked at negotiations over the last 200 years involving the UK and otherwise, there would be grumbles from different interlocutors, different stages of the negotiations, without prejudice to the final result. I hope that's fair.
Yeah, I have in mind the Munich Agreement, for example, and look where that ended up. But anyway, as far as your point is concerned, of course, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And that, therefore, means that we have to take the package as a whole. And he's made these remarks, which are pretty lethal in their own in their own way. But I now want to move on to the next question I'd like to ask Mr. Robbins, because astonishingly, and do come in, Mr. Raab, if you'd like to, on this one, because there is a political element to it as well. Astonishingly, the new white paper, which was published on the 12th of July, setting out the legislative proposals for implementing the withdrawal agreement, compromises and contradicts the repeal of the European Communities Act 1972 as of exit day on the 29th of March 2019. Parliament only enacted that repeal 16 days before the publication of that white paper. Why is the government now seeking to keep the 1972 Act alive at all? And what guarantee is there of a total repeal of that Act? And how long do the government intend the Common Rule Book to continue with our being rule takers from the EU 27 and from behind closed doors? You go first, and then if Mr. Raab would like to come in, with pleasure.
Certainly. I think what you're referring to, Chairman, is that the withdrawal agreement, if things go according to plan, as the Secretary of State has said, the withdrawal agreement that we hope to conclude later this autumn will provide for an implementation period, as the government has sought since last September, and that implementation period will provide for us to continue to trade on exactly current terms. And that's the context, the technical context for the commitments the government has made in respect of the legislation.
But the Withdrawal Act quite clearly states that the repeal of the 1972 Act takes effect on exit day, namely the 29th of March 2019. It doesn't actually say, that's the law of the land. It doesn't say anything in there about implementation periods or any extension of the period, for example, beyond the 30th of December 2020. So I just want to get that down in hard reality as far as you're concerned. What do you make of that? There is quite clearly we pass an act, then we come forward with new proposals for a new act, which are inconsistent with the act that's already been passed.
Chairman, I don't think with respect they are inconsistent. The government remains completely committed to leaving the European Union on the 29th of March of next year. The draft withdrawal agreement that we are working on with the European Union, as has been government policy for some time, seeks to extend the current basis of our trading relationship for 21 months beyond that date. And I think that's what the withdrawal agreement bill white paper was attempting to explain.
And Mr. Raab?
Yes. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I think as a matter of constitutional principle, all the political questions you should give me a chance to answer first. Now,
well, I'm giving you a chance.
No, but not first, because actually...
You weren't in on the Act when all this was decided.
Well, I was. Because I was part of the bill team taking the EU withdrawal bill through the House of Commons. So I can give you two reassurances. One in relation...
a very minor role.
Who knows? I'm happy to perform in a minor role or a more significant role, but make whatever modest contribution I can. But what I can do is give you the reassurance that yes, there is a savings clause in relation to the implementation period and the way it applies to the EU Withdrawal Act. And of course, when we passed the EU Withdrawal Act, and no one will know better than you because you participated in so many of those debates, we envisaged that it was out without prejudice to the negotiations that we were making in relation to both the withdrawal agreement but also the implementation period. So that was a very clear basis on which that legislation was passed, and I remember talking to it myself during lengthy sessions.
But an act is an act. It doesn't have the kind of reservations that you're putting forward apply to it. It just doesn't work like that. An act is an act. The law of the land says what it says. But I'm not going to pursue that one now. I've made my point. You've tried to reply to it, and we'll leave it at that. Okay?
Fair dues.
So the next question, Mr. David Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to ask one or two questions about historical matters before you were actually at the Department Secretary of State, so I hope you'll forgive me if I address the questions to Mr. Robbins. First of all, I'm interested in the by of the sequencing of the negotiations. The sequencing, I think, was set out by the European Union in its guidelines, which were developed by the Council. I think that's right, isn't it? And I think that the provision of guidelines is specifically catered for in Article 50. That's correct too, isn't it? So Article 50 gives the authority for the EU to produce these guidelines. However, the Article 50 also provides that the negotiations should take into account the framework for the future relationship between the departing member state and the continuing European Union. The guidelines actually set out by the Council provided that discussions about the future relationship could not take place until 3 issues had been resolved, namely the issue of citizens' rights, the issue of money, and the third issue, I'm sure you remind me?
The specific issues around the withdrawal for Northern Ireland.
Yes. Now, why did the British government agree that sequencing when it was clearly contrary to the express provisions of Article 50?
The government decided that the important thing here was to get on to discussing the partnership it wanted to reach with the European Union, and is very clear that that is exactly, as you say, Mr. Jones, what Article 50 provides for. So we entered into discussions on those 3 issues that the European Council had particularly wanted to put early in the negotiations. We reached satisfactory outcomes on them from ministers' point of view, and the decision was taken that that was a good strategy for getting on to the discussion that ministers were keen to get into as quickly as possible on the future relationship, as you'll remember.
But didn't that amount to a concession to the European Union?
I think the important thing, Mr. Jones, as the chairman has reminded us, is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And in that spirit, as ministers were very clear, needed to be written into that, the report that we jointly agreed in December, that all of these agreements were agreements in principle with a view to an outcome in compliance with Article 50.
But isn't it very hard to resile from an agreement in principle at a later stage? And is it not the case that the British government has made a significant number of concessions? For example, it's made a concession in terms of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and it's also made a concession in terms of the money. It's agreed in outline terms a very large sum of money to be paid to the European Union at the time of our departure. That's right, isn't it?
I think the important thing here, Mr. Jones, if I may, and I'm sure the Secretary of State will want to come in on this because it's something he and I have spent a lot of time on since he took office, is that the government's been very clear, including in that provisional agreement reached last December, that our view is that you're right, Article 50 means that these 2 outcomes that we hope for this autumn should be linked, and therefore what we have been discussing with the Commission is making sure that the document that we hope to agree later on this year that describes our future partnership with the European Union is referred to, as Article 50 implies it should be, by the withdrawal agreement.
Yes, I think it is. If we're going to, as we rightly do and our European friends do, refer to the fact that the different elements of this package are one deal, one bargain, then there's no deal till you've got the whole deal, and that must mean that there's clear linkage between the 2, and there must be, in my view, and I think we'll make progress on this, is that reflected in the future relationship document, but also in the withdrawal agreement. So I hope that gives you, Mr. Jones, a degree of reassurance.
Nevertheless, the concessions that I mentioned were substantial concessions, albeit in principle. Could you give me 2 examples of similar concessions that the European Union has made to the United Kingdom in the course of negotiations so far? I mean, similar in terms of scale.
Do you mean on the withdrawal agreement or on the future relationship?
Well, I think either, really.
Well, on the withdrawal agreement in the implementation period, I think the fact that during the IP we're able to negotiate free trade arrangements is welcome, because that is an exemption or a derogation, if you like, from the wider approach to that. In relation to the future relationship, you can see from the press conference that I did with Michel Barnier on Friday the list, if you like, an itinerary of areas where we've made progress. And yes, some of those obviously are in areas which are very difficult for the EU. And of course, in relation to the Chequers proposals, we talk a lot about these as to the compromises we've had to make, and I make no bones about them. Mr Jones, you know them, there'll be members of this committee that will feel that. This is also asking for a big compromise from the EU in all the ways that we've heard about. So that's the bread and butter of any negotiation.
It just seems to me that we have made considerable concessions, and there are very few of similar scale that have been made in the other direction.
I think one of the aspects here, and you touched on it with the sequencing, is that a lot of the difficult bit for us has come early because the withdrawal agreement involves the money, the IP and the rest of it, and although it also involves areas where we've got very clear mutual interests, I would include the most obvious one being citizens' rights. I think, if you like, the sunlit uplands of the package, the bit which incentivises the UK and is obviously going to be a very powerful part of making sure we've got that balance, is the future relationship. And that's an area where actually, if you look at some of the progress that we've made, and I need to be very careful, Mr Chairman, and you'll know this as a former minister in DEXU, to protect the integrity of the negotiating room. But if you look at some of the areas around criminal justice cooperation, the internal security, but also the progress we've made on external security, and it's not me touting it, actually look at Mr Barnier's press conference statement on Friday. These are all areas where we are making progress towards our goal, and we're confident we can reach a deal. And I think when we get the deal that we want, when it's looked at in the round, you will see the balance, which I think, if I read into your questions, you're looking for.
So the balance is yet to be revealed.
There's no deal until you have the whole deal. I think I've heard you say that before.
I've said it several times.
You're right.
I wonder if one further historic matter, which I'd like to, again, with respect, ask Mr Robbins about, and that's the issue of the white paper that was published shortly after the Chequers meeting. It's been said that this was wholly different from a previous draft white paper that had been prepared. Is that correct?
No, it's not. The white paper was based upon an accumulation of collective decision-making over many months. So, of course, some of the absolutely critical decisions were taken at that meeting of the Cabinet at Chequers immediately before the white paper was published. But and probably the majority of the proposals in the white paper were accumulated from meetings of Cabinet and its subcommittees over many months before Chequers. It is absolutely true to say, of course, that once the Cabinet had reached a view on some of those critical choices that they had before them at that meeting, further work needed to be done to the white paper before it could be published. But if I may say so, I think that's reasonably standard procedure.
When did the members of the Cabinet see the Chequers proposals before they were discussed?
I think the Acting Cabinet Secretary has briefed the Public Administration Select Committee on this as well. The Prime Minister asked for a number of papers to be issued to ministers in the run-up to that meeting, and I think they started to be distributed from memory, on the Monday. You'll understand, given the normal conventions around Cabinet, there's a limit to what I can and should say about this.
I understand. Is it the case that some members of the Cabinet did not receive the papers until 24 to 48 hours before the discussion?
Everybody received the papers at the same time, Mr Jones. I can absolutely guarantee that.
Can you give me an indication of the size of those papers? How many pages would we be talking about?
I think, if I may say so, Mr Jones and Chairman, I think we are getting into the territory that the Acting Cabinet Secretary was reluctant to get into with your sister committee about the internal workings of the Cabinet. I must bow to him on that.
Can you indicate whether there are a large number of documents?
So, as I say, Mr Jones, the Prime Minister directed that there should be a series of papers about the issues and about the options. So, yes, there were several.
Was it at that Chequers meeting that the idea of a common rule book was first discussed?
It was the first time that the Cabinet had discussed it, yes. And the ideas behind it had been, of course, been debated really since the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, as different options were discussed for how to give effect to the ambition that she put forward in that speech.
Thank you.
Richard Jacks. Mr Robbins, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Just a couple of questions, if I may. First of all, do you believe that leaving the EU is a good thing? You personally, in your heart. Are you right behind this in every single sense of that?
I am right behind, as I have been since I joined the civil service proudly in 1996. I'm right behind the policy of the government of the day, Mr. Jacks.
So there's no part of you that wants to keep the country attached to the EU?
There is no part of my personal views that will ever play a role in how I serve the government of the day.
Just going back to that cabinet meeting, my understanding is that the paper that Mr. Davis produced was in effect a CETA plus type paper, Canada style, which Mr. Barnier, and I quote, 2nd of August 2018, the EU has offered a free trade agreement with zero tariffs and no quantitative restrictions for goods. It proposed closed customs and regulatory cooperation and access to public procurement markets, to name but a few examples. If this CETA plus, or whatever you'd like to call it, it's called Canada-style agreement, is agreeable to the EU, and Mr. Tusk made similar noises, why have we got the Chequers deal, which has completely the opposite effect? It's upset the Brexiteers, dare I sadly have to use that phrase still, because we should all be Brexiteers, should we not? The Remainers, and everybody else. And the EU, who, as we've heard earlier, they said this Chequers deal is non-starter. So why was the Canada Plus deal not put before the Cabinet?
So I will bow to the Secretary of State on the government's view.
He wasn't there, you were.
Certainly, Mr. Jacks. What I'm trying to explain is that ministers remain behind the white paper that was produced because they believe that it is a sensible package overall. And to be completely straight with you, when I say that a variety of papers were produced for that meeting, all of the options were looked at very seriously, and it's for the reasons that the white paper advocates that ministers went with the option that they did.
Mr. Drax, may I add a supplementary reflection on this?
Please do.
Particularly as some of what you're asking is not related before my appointment, but since. The suggestion that has been made following the visit of the Select Committee to Brussels and the conversations with Michel Barnier, which I welcome and indeed would encourage parliamentarians should be engaged in the process in this way, it has been suggested that it would be CETA plus or CETA plus plus on the Canada style, but I think you need to check the small print of the offer that is being made in relation to the appendage of the backstop that the EU is proposing, which ultimately would involve a limbo period to be determined and ultimately agreed, but with the consent of the EU, which could proceed indefinitely. So for those who are coming back and citing this as evidence that actually there is some polar alternative which doesn't resolve the Northern Ireland point, can I just gently say that I hope that they will apply the same scrutiny of the small print as they do with the government?
Well, if I may gently say to you, Minister, that the Northern Ireland issue, in my humble opinion, has been blown out of all proportion. There's a perfectly, and I'm sure one of my colleagues here would agree with me, many probably, that this is being used, sadly, in part, to make the withdrawal difficult. And I add here, to the notes I've got, that if the EU have 100% tariff and quota-free deal on goods, then there is little need for a customs border in the north, in the island of Ireland. And we must also remember there are already customs control in various areas between the two borders. And having served out there on 3 tours, I can tell you that if the Irish government started to put up some sort of restrictions on the border, there would be an outcry, not just from the north, but also from the south. It just wouldn't happen.
All of which may be true, but my very minor discrete point was merely to accurately convey the nature of the offer that is being bandied around from Monsieur Barnier as the alternative. It is not what has been described, because it misses a crucial point, and I'll be and my point really is to say that I hope the same rigour that you're applying to myself, quite rightly, and the government's proposals is being applied as a matter of fact to what the EU is telling you, because I think that would be a judicious and fair way to proceed, but also one which clearly and accurately represents what the choices are.
And final point, Chairman, I'm taking up a lot of time, I know, thank you for that. The Canada Plus Plus, it seems to me, call it whatever you will, seems to take us much further forward and closer to a deal than the Chequers deal. Would you agree with that?
Well, again, no, because on the basis of the EU proposed backstop for Northern Ireland, which is a part of that, that is utterly unacceptable. And I don't understand why anyone of the Brexit flavouring, particularly the passionate bit, would cite that as a credible alternative.
I'm not advocating it, Minister. I'm not advocating that we split the country at all.
No, you're not. But
what I'm saying is it can be resolved. But what I'm saying to you is that Canada Plus Plus, is that, as a whole, a better way forward, and we get much more people behind it and a better will to succeed, rather than a Chequers deal, which, according to the Common Rulebook and various other things, will not see us free of the EU. That is a fact.
So point one, I just want to be clear that the EU is not offering that. Now, obviously this is a negotiation, and that's why both in relation to the protocol, but also more generally our FCA proposals, we're going to continue negotiating. What I'm clear on, and the government is clear on, is that if you want to strive for the best deal, which ensures frictionless trade but frees us up to have an independent trade policy, if it wants to resolve the challenge of making sure we don't see any extra infrastructure along the Northern Irish Republic of Ireland border, this is by far the most plausible and credible and effective way of doing that. And I'm just gently saying that the alternative that's been suggested did not come from Michel Barnier's lips. It may be something which you think is deliverable, and I respect the views around this room. It is not what Michel Barnier has been offering. Very important to note that.
Yes, I'd just like to ask Mr. Robbins a question, because you would not have been involved in this, Mr. Raab, I think. And that is this. Did either the Prime Minister, or for that matter, any other person within the framework of the government, make available to any of the EU institutions or any of its officers the provisions which were contained in the Chequers proposals before the 6th of July?
No.
Absolutely nothing at all, in any shape or form.
So if you're asking about the paperwork that went to Cabinet, the white paper, of course, those are internal government documents. What ministers and officials have been doing especially hard since the Mansion House speech that the Prime Minister delivered is exploring all the options for achieving those objectives. You haven't answered my question. Any shape or form, did they go to any person inside the EU institutions or any of the member states in any shape or form? Advice to ministers is advice to ministers. It's not shared with the EU.
No, advice to the EU as to what it is we're proposing to do is quite a separate question, and I'd like an answer to that, please.
I am trying to answer it, Chairman, because of course, as the Secretary of State has said, we are in a negotiation. Ministers had set forward their objectives. The Prime Minister, in a collectively agreed speech at Mansion House, had put her objectives forward, and from her down, her team of ministers and officials have been sounding out how we might achieve those objectives. So what I don't want to do is to say to you, no idea that eventually appeared in the white paper had ever been mentioned to somebody on the other side of this negotiation before, because it wouldn't be good advice to ministers if we gave them no indication whatsoever as to whether ideas were acceptable.
Well, I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of this sooner or later, but I'd now like to move on to question 2. Mr. Tomlinson.
Chairman, thank you. Secretary of State, good afternoon. About the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, and primarily for you, please, because removal of the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice has been one of the key objectives in leaving the European Union. And yet it's been agreed that the continued jurisdiction of those parts of the withdrawal agreement that don't concern the continuation of EU law, for example, we mentioned the financial settlement during the implementation period. Why is that? Why has that been agreed in that way?
Well, I don't want to rely on the distinction that the Chairman has drawn about things that have been agreed before my time.
No.
But
I'm asking it primarily of you.
Say again?
I'm asking it primarily of you.
No, I understand. But I can't give you a factual account of the decision-making process at that point, but I think the view was taken that the most straightforward way of making sure we had the smooth transition with one change at the end of our departure was to have a single moment when that was done at the end of the implementation period. Equally, I think what you're getting at is in relation to the conditionality between the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship agreement, that will also rest on the clause that Ollie's mentioned and that we are looking at very carefully with our EU partners and internally about how we will get the most effective linkage. And so in relation to that, dispute resolution hasn't yet been concluded.
And then looking to the future and after the implementation period, have you succeeded in cutting down the proposal for continuing the jurisdiction of the CJEU in any way?
Well, certainly in relation to the wider questions of dispute resolution, both within the withdrawal agreement and except in relation to citizens' rights as a bespoke governance mechanism, but beyond the IP and in relation to the future relationship, the model that we've got is based on arbitration. And the advantage of that is it allows both sides to appoint, and this is our proposal, it's subject to negotiation, but it allows both sides to propose an arbitrator or two, and then they choose a chairman. What you have with that is a sense, and of course the arbitrators should conduct themselves independently. They're there for their professional capacity, not their political affiliation. But what you have is a sense that both parties can feel confident in the overall balance, and that is the global practice. We've discussed that in the House of Commons, debated it endlessly, and I think it is a really important way of making sure not just individual disputes are resolved fairly in a way that both sides have confidence, but preserving the relationship. And I worked as both in the City and the Foreign Office as a lawyer before becoming a politician. And I think with dispute resolution, you're trying to achieve two things. You're trying to resolve the dispute, but preserve the relationship. And I think arbitration ultimately is a very effective means of doing that. It can feel very technical, it can feel very protracted, but in terms of what we want to be able to do, resolve disputes with certainty, preserve the relationship, I think it's very effective. And of course it means ending the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
And that is a clear objective after the IP, after the implementation period, that will happen.
Well, look for yourself. It's in both white papers.
Well, moving on, because you said just then that you're aiming that both sides can have confidence in the process, and yet the enforcement and compliance provisions of the withdrawal agreement have been described as one-sided. What attempt or progress are you making at redressing that balance?
Well, I don't accept that assumption, but I think what is true is if, for example, in the IP or in relation to some bespoke areas, we say we're going to apply common rules and that policy decision is made, you want to have clear and consistent interpretation of that. And so, for example, you don't want, and this would be to the detriment of the UK if we had double standards in the application of the rules, which is why you want that commonality of interpretation. So there are provisions that allow, for example, the arbitral panel to say, agree by decision of them, so as a whole, well actually we need to, before we decide this dispute, we need to be very clear what EU law says on something, and that may be to the benefit of one or other side, depending on what the matrix of competing claims are in a case. But actually, once it comes back down, you're clear on the discrete point of law as an aid to interpretation. The arbitral decision decides how that fits in to the broader legislative framework, and indeed, most crucially, its application to the facts. I think that's a sensible approach.
Doesn't that eventually take us into the influence of the ECJ? You've read the papers that have been written by Martin Howe. I'm sure you studied them very carefully. And also, of course, what happens in the EFTA court, if one takes a comparison with that, which is quite clear. I've met the chairman or president of that court, previous president, and he's written a book in which he makes it quite clear that, we had some correspondence with him actually, about the extent to which the golden thread, as he puts it, of EU jurisdiction does effectively influence and affect the outcome of the decisions that are taken. You're against that from what you seem to be saying now, and therefore I'm asking you again just to repeat that in the absence of our going down that kind of route, you would be happy for the ultimate decisions to be taken by arbitration as a matter of fact and as a matter of law. Is that correct? And that should be taken by them and not by the European Court or influenced by it?
So I think, first of all, you've made a very powerful argument, Mr. Chairman, as to why we shouldn't go down the EA-EFTA route. that is why we've chosen and proposed, and I think are making good headway with our European friends, on a process which is bespoke. And yes, in those areas where EU principles will apply, and that is a political decision that we have made at a strategic level since before my time, but I agree and accept it, for example, on citizens' rights, but there may be other areas. I do think you want to make sure you have a consistent approach so that you don't find EU nationals here benefiting from something which UK expats abroad wouldn't. There will be other examples. You want consistent and uniform interpretation. One of the worst things around general international law and European law is if it becomes haphazard in its application to either side. But that aside, for the overwhelming bulk of areas where we continue to cooperate beyond the IP, but particularly under our future relationship, beyond the separation, I think what we will have is very clearly an independent mechanism applying the future relationship as an international treaty, yes, with arbitrators from both sides, but doing it in a way that is based on the law predicated in those agreements and independently done from the ECJ. I think that's what a balanced and effective approach looks like. And actually our proposals and the traction that we've got on arbitration has been one of the big unsung victories not victories yet, we haven't done the deal, but actually we've won the argument around that in a way that I don't think has perhaps been fully appreciated. And I do think that's, to come back to Mr. James's point, one of the areas where we've actually done a good job as a team of making the case for a bespoke approach to dispute resolution.
And of course, making the case is not necessarily the same as getting the European Union to accept it, but let's park that one for the moment.
Sure.
Kate Herry.
Thank you. Secretary of State, I'd like to probe just a little bit more on the backstop. In the technical note on the temporary customs arrangement, the government made it clear that it would not agree to the inclusion of a backstop unless the end state customs arrangement had been agreed, so that the backstop, if needed, would only operate until the new customs arrangement was finalised. Is this still the case? Is the government insisting that the detail of the future customs arrangement must be settled within the scope of Article 50 negotiations before any backstop is agreed?
Well, we've made very clear that we're committed to the joint report and the undertaking that we will prepare a backstop. That was the result of the decision made in December. But equally, you're absolutely right to say that the sustainable, long-term, enduring solution to this is to have the economic partnership we've described. And one of the advantages for all its detractors, in some quarters, of the facilitated customs arrangement is it allows us to apply and resolve the Northern Ireland issue within the future relationship. And I think that's very important. We've also been categorical, I think it's fair to say, and I want to be careful because in a negotiation you need to retain some flexibility, but in objecting to and rejecting the EU proposals on the backstop. And that position has been held very firm.
And Mr. Robbins, have you visited the border often?
Not in this job, no, Ms. Hay.
When were you last at any of the border parts of Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland?
That would probably be in my time working as Deputy National Security Advisor, so that would be in the mid-2000s.
Have you visited either of the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland in the last 5 years?
Yes, I have.
Which part?
So my duties in this job have taken me to Dublin on several occasions.
But not to Belfast?
No, not yet.
Right. I just wondered if you had read, and certainly I would ask you to read a very good article by Dr. Graham Gudgeon, who was David Trimble's advisor and is a professor at Oxford, today, which he's written on the Irish border. Now, he does know the border, as obviously you understandably don't. And he's written very clearly why the whole issue of the border problem, in inverted commas, has been so ridiculously overhyped. Secretary of State, do you understand why people sometimes feel, not just people who wanted to leave the EU, but many people who supported the Remain side, can't understand why this whole issue of the border is such a big issue, when actually, as he points out very clearly, Cameras are currently in use on the border. Checks on food standards for exports occur at factories. Customs officers and police monitor cross-border activities. People are stopped regularly. Differences in VAT, excise duties, the smuggling that went on. Our own Northern Ireland Select Committee looked into the fuel smuggling issues that are there. And all of these things, with us leaving the EU, are no different, really, can be solved by genuine cooperation and a willingness to make it work. Do you understand why some people perhaps are using this as an issue to make it as difficult as possible?
So first of all, I certainly accept your point, Ms. Horry, that there is already a regulatory border, excise VAT and other things in the way you've described, but that's different from having the hard border or the infrastructure at the border in the way that people are concerned about.
Well, what do you mean? Define a hard border.
Well, I'm
is
sure
a camera a hard border?
I think from our point of view, we don't want to see any additional substantive infrastructure at the border. But to come back to your question, I think there are genuinely legitimate range of views as to how intractable this is as an issue in practice. My view is this is a substantive issue we must resolve. Equally, there are clearly some in some quarters of the EU who appreciate this is a political pressure point on the UK. And this is a negotiation, people apply pressure points, and I think you're right about that.
Mr. Robbins, do you agree?
I agree with everything the Secretary of State has said.
But you agree that there are people in the EU who are using this as a stick?
I think my job is to worry about what ministers want from this negotiation, and from the very start, ministers have been completely consistent. And
but ministers seem to listen to you very much, don't they?
I give my advice, as my team does, and in particular the Northern Ireland office does on this issue, and I think the commitments that British ministers have shown down the years to the peace process don't need any further.
But have you anyone in your department, any civil servant, who actually understands and appreciates the border issue and can talk about it, other than with someone like you who haven't been there for a long time? Who is giving you all this advice? Who is helping? Why don't you have some of these people who come up with solutions in to help?
So, if I may, Secretary of State, I think the work we've done on this issue, the cross-government team has done on this issue, has been extremely well supported, both by our dialogue with the authorities in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Civil Service, obviously in the absence at the moment of the Executive, with the Police Service in Northern Ireland, and particularly crucially with HMRC, who of course have reserved responsibilities in Northern Ireland. So there has been a great deal of technical focus on these issues. We have spoken to a very wide range of stakeholders as the government team. I have not read that article, and I would like to and will do after this session. But I think ministers have had a very detailed and constant set of advice about how to resolve the issues. As the Secretary of State has said, there is a constitutional reality that at the point we leave the European Union, two jurisdictions that were previously governed in common on some things that drive borders in many parts of the world no longer will be. And what ministers have said from the start is they want to make sure that the outcome of that is not to lead to a return to border infrastructure that becomes a political issue. And I think we have conveyed our seriousness about that consistently to the EU side. As the Secretary of State has said, the EU's solution to it as proposed in February, ministers have found to be completely unacceptable. And so we have been trying to put forward and discuss other ideas, most notably since the White Paper was published, returning to the idea that, of course, we remain committed to a backstop, but the best solution in the round is to find a plan that solves the UK-EU relationship much more generally.
And how often do you meet the Irish government officials?
I meet and talk to a wide range of EU member state officials, and I speak to several of them every week.
And do you tell them that a lot of people think it's all nonsense?
I've had some very difficult discussions about the fact that my ministers are very concerned that the proposal put forward in February takes little account of the political realities in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland.
Sorry, could I add a couple of comments? First of all, I appreciate what star billing Ollie is whenever he comes. And we've developed a very effective professional relationship. But let's bear in mind, we're the two that come and give evidence. We have, in addition to all the advice and technical support that we have in an endeavour of this kind, which Brexit represents. We've got the Northern Ireland office. I don't think anyone could seriously say that they lack for expertise or could give us the first-hand kind of technical advice that you're referring to. And also, let's remember that you shouldn't let ministers off the hook, because advisors advise and ministers decide. And so we get the excellent advice from all of our civil servants and Ollie obviously, but the whole team. But ultimately it's on our hook. So don't let people like me off the hook, because it's very important, as fun as that is, that we respect the role and the integrity of the civil service, and that we make sure we've got clear lines of advice, we get the full candour of their views, but ultimately ministers are paid and appointed to exercise their judgment, and we are constitutionally responsible for that, including to your committee.
Secretary of State, as someone who campaigned with you to leave the European Union, I'm certainly not going to let you off the hook. But just one final point. I mean, do you not think that perhaps we got ourselves into this situation about the Irish border because too early on we kind of accepted the sort of this idea that it was this huge issue, and yet it's such a tiny part of the whole 27 other countries aspect, and we've got ourselves into this position because we haven't stood up at the beginning to saying this is a nonsense, we're not going to allow you to play politics with this.
Well, I don't want to get into trouble with Mr. Jones by blaming everything that someone doesn't like on what happened before. I don't think... I think it's easy to look back in hindsight. I do agree with you, though, that it's important to shine a light on the reality of the situation. And actually that's true both for the communities in Northern Ireland and for the Republic of Ireland, and the reality on the ground, in the same way as we're being tested by the EU to understand the GB Northern Ireland reality. So what we ought to do is have a fact-based approach and a sensible dialogue about this issue. It is important substantively, but I agree it needs to, in fact, in Michel Barnier's words, it needs to be de-dramatised.
I ought to add that we issued a report on the 20th of March in which we criticised the government for not being sufficiently robust, effectively being far too supplicating to EU, effectively, in fact, giving in to them and actually more or less asking them what they would be prepared to put up with. And that is also part of what Mr. Jones has raised, and also Kate Hoey. And it's a really important question. We have been very critical, given the fact that we left the European Union under an Act of Parliament, the Withdrawal Act, by decision that was taken by the whole of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, by Parliament as a whole. We've made that decision in the light of the instructions from the British people. It's an Act of Parliament, and we have no business whatever compromising the position of the people of Northern Ireland or the people of the United Kingdom in making any kind of concessions on the question of the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. And I'm sure both of you would agree with that, would you not?
Absolutely, and not only is that the Prime Minister's position, but I think judges by... I think you're better off judging governments by what they do rather than just what they say. And whilst our overriding priority is to strive for the deal we want, we expect, we think is in both sides' mutual interest, we're also doing this patient, assiduous, painstaking work, some of it behind closed doors, but increasingly a public engaging focus to it on the no-deal scenario. And there'll be people that will criticise us for that and on the other side of this debate, but the reality is we've made clear that no deal is better than a bad deal. We want the optimum solution, that's what we're striving for, but we are doing the work to make sure that, yes, there'll be risks if we leave with no deal, but that we can avoid, mitigate or manage them. And I hope that would at least give you and your committee, Mr. Chairman, some degree of reassurance in that regard.
Philippa Whitford, please.
Thank you, Chair.
Marcus, did you want to come in on that? All right, Marcus first and then Philippa.
No problem.
I just wanted to ask, why has the government acquiesced to the Irish desire to interpret no hard border as no border, and there's no infrastructure or checks of any kind anywhere in the island of Ireland? That took place under your auspices rather than the Secretary of State's, Mr. Robbins. Why did the government choose to acquiesce in that way?
If I may, Secretary of State, I think So I was trying to explain in response to Ms Hoey that the government has been consistent from the date of the referendum that it wants to avoid a return to the borders of the past, and that it sees the absence of physical infrastructure at the border as an important part of that commitment. So much is made, understandably, of differences between the Irish government view, the views of the parties in Northern Ireland, and the British government view about this. I think ministers prefer to see some of the consistencies here, which is the shared determination to avoid a return to the border.
Just on the backstop in general, I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what the current government strategy is with respect to the backstop. My understanding is that it's pushing the EU for the backstop to be a UK-wide backstop. I was just wondering what legal basis you would envisage such a backstop for having, and what would be the extent of the extension of the regulation, for example, such as we are seeing proposed in Chequers. Is it more than Chequers, less than Chequers, or is it Chequers? And how can it be made temporary in law?
Well, you will know, Mr. Fish, the elements of the proposal that we made in distinct contrast to the EU protocol or proposed protocol. You're right that what we would envisage is a presumption in favour of a UK-wide approach, but I think most importantly is it would need to be as circumscribed as possible and as time limited as possible. But in December we signed up to that commitment to come up with a backstop, and so obviously our focus is on making sure we have an end game, future relationship which solves this problem, resolves the issue, and that's the overriding focus. But we signed up to that commitment, and I think we've got to be true to that as well, to make sure. But so you're right in your description of it, but we envisage and we would hope and expect it would never be exercised, and if it was, that it would be for a very finite, short period.
But how in law does it end? Why, and on whose, whose action would it end?
Well, there's different ways of doing it, aren't there? And we haven't got the agreement on that yet, but it could either be by a fixed period, it could be by agreement of the parties. There's a possibility you could have a sunset, but there could be a procedural trigger for it to end. There are all sorts of ways it can end. So in law, I'm not worried about that. There's enough malleability. I think the question is the political bridge between the two sides.
It was pretty stupid, wasn't it?
What, to agree in December?
Yeah.
I think our confidence, and it was before my time, but even looking at it and discussing it with members of the government at the time, our confidence was that we would make sufficient progress, get on to the future relationship, and be able to resolve this issue, and that remains our view.
But was it not conceded in order to get a transition which the Chancellor said had a value, and that value would diminish over time should that not become a settled matter? And are we not now into the period where that value is diminishing extremely rapidly?
Not sure. It's certainly true to say that part of the package was an implementation period which has proved to be much shorter than I think some people had feared. And I think the IP is important to give businesses the certainty that there's one change of rules, but also important for, if you like, the leave voting perspective to see some finality. And what we don't want to see is that undercut by a limbo backstop, which brings me back to the point that I was trying to make as respectfully as possible to Mr. Drax about what actually the EU proposal on CETA Plus involves, because what we couldn't agree is to a limbo period that held us indefinitely in a backstop which actually within the gift of the EU prevented us from getting on to the future state as reflected in the new special and deep partnership that we intend to sign.
Okay, Philippa Whitford now.
Thank you. Yesterday, Secretary of State asked you about the impact of the amendment in the Customs Bill of the government accepting new Clause 36, which makes it unlawful for HMRC to account for duties of customs, excise or VAT to the EU. And at that time yesterday you said that has no impact. But the facilitated customs arrangement is absolutely central to Chequers, and central to the facilitated customs arrangement is this proposal that the United Kingdom will collect duties, which it will then give to Europe. And in the Chequers white paper, it says it has no request that the EU 27 do the same in return. So surely this has a significant impact on the white paper.
So firstly, I don't accept that the amendments that were passed are inconsistent with the white paper proposals. And secondly, just for the sake of accuracy, what we're talking about is a formula for repayment and a reciprocally agreed revenue formula and remittance mechanism. And I know some of the detail that's very technical, but that is very different from, I think, the way, with respect, that you described it.
So perhaps you could explain then the difference between the HMRC accounting for these duties to the EU and collecting these duties for the EU.
Well, one is done up front and the other one is a remittance mechanism based on a revenue formula which is done after the event, which means that on our analysis up to 96% of goods would pay no tariff or the lower of the two alternative tariffs at the border. And there's been some pushback on whether that is misleading because it represents only it represents imports and exports, but actually the figure, even if you just include exports to the UK, is still very close to that.
But the facilitated customs arrangement is very much that it will allow goods to come into the UK from external countries. Some of them will be marked for UK use and will be at whatever tariff the UK government sets. Some will be passing on to the EU. And the proposal in the white paper is that the UK will collect those customs duties and forward them. But new clause 36 makes that unlawful. I'm sorry, I still don't understand in what way in the customs bill, new clause, it's now obviously clause 54, does not contradict the facilitated customs arrangement.
I'm afraid it's because, and we've obviously taken legal advice on it, I'm afraid your interpretation of quite the mismatch is not correct, it's not accurate. It is that and we've looked at this very carefully and wouldn't have been able to accept the amendments if we felt it undercut the process. So I know it's very technical, but I don't believe, and I'm confident that the amendments leave us in a strong position to be able to propose the FCA, and we've worked through that and talked through that with our EU partners as well.
Okay, perhaps you could explain to me then what the amendment does make unlawful. What does it mean?
I think it's for the authors of the amendment to explain what they envisage, but But
your government, and you are the Brexit Secretary of State, accepted it. Indeed, you whipped your MPs to support it. So I'm assuming you know what it means. You're suggesting I'm misinterpreting it. So I'd be grateful if you would explain what it actually means. English.
I'm very happy to give you the reassurance that what it will not do is undercut the approach that we're taking, which is to have the UK acting as if it's a combined customs territory with the EU by levying our own tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the UK and the EU's tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the EU. It will avoid any new routine customs checks and controls for the UK and EU trade, and I think that's one of the crucial points. But the way that we will effectively, after the event, tally up is to have a reciprocally agreed tariff revenue formula and tariff repayment mechanism. And I don't think that...
What do you mean reciprocally agreed? Are you expecting EU27 to collect tariffs on behalf of the UK when you say reciprocally agreed?
It will be the tariff revenue formula and the repayment mechanism that we would want to agree.
But you're not asking the EU27 to collect tariffs for the UK?
That's not my understanding of it, no.
Okay. Well, I will find Priti Patel then and ask what that does mean. I'm still surprised that it was accepted by the government. To me, it seems to drive a coach and horses through the FCA.
Well, we looked at it very carefully, and I hope I can give you that reassurance.
Well, perhaps maybe you could write to us in clear English and explain what it does, what it makes unlawful and what it doesn't.
I'd be very happy to write and explain why we're confident that the FCA is consistent with the amendments the government has accepted.
Okay. Obviously, what it does suggest is applying lower tariffs to goods that would be coming to a UK market rather than those that would then be going on to the EU. How on earth would you avoid counterfeiting and contamination if there's clearly a higher tariff on one than the other?
Well, HMRC has got a long track record of policing not identical issues. This is clearly an innovative approach, but we're confident in their capacity and their expertise, although it will be adapted to the specific regime that we're putting in place. So my confidence is based on the track record of HMRC in policing things like excise, in particular VAT.
I mean, obviously, it's this kind of contamination, and particularly around things like foodstuffs, etc., meat from outside the UK, that is a concern in Ireland with a non-border. So how do you avoid contamination of the UK EU market and the UK external market?
Well, I'm very happy to write and give a more lengthy explanation. It's something that's obviously been very carefully checked through with DEFRA officials and the other range of customs officials and expertise that we've had. So if I may, at the end of this, Mr. Chairman, if there are particularly technical issues or particular points that I'm unable to answer, I will follow up with a letter and try and address them all.
I think it's quite important because the FCA, to me, reading the white paper, seems to be the entire thing that it is all built on. Now, obviously, under most favoured nation principle, World Trade Organization doesn't allow a country to treat members differently, and yet the UK is asking to be allowed to behave as if in a customs union with the EU, but not in a customs union, which is one of the exemptions of most favoured nation. Why will the World Trade Organization accept that the UK has a different deal with Europe to other World Trade Organisations? Is it not that the UK is just going to end up embedded in multiple appeals and complaints within the World Trade Organisation system?
Oh, I think when we leave the EU with one or other aspect of the arrangements that we put in place, we may be at risk of legal challenge. That almost inevitably, when the government changes a significant legal framework, but whether it's successful or not, which is, I think your question is another matter. I think what the key thing is, we are trying to promote frictionless trade. We're trying to respect not just the principles but the spirit of what the WTO is about. But what I do accept is we've come up with a mechanism which is innovative. I think one of the challenges we've had with the EU is we're proposing something innovative, and I think that's difficult with the dry legalism that sometimes grips the Commission, if I can put it that way. Equally, I think the EU, and indeed other international bureaucracies, and I was a Foreign Office lawyer for 6 years, are at their best when they adapt to those innovative approaches. And I think the point I would make to you is that this is about the technical way within which we give effect to the free trade rules and substantive principles under the WTO, but also our arrangements with the EU. And it's a technical mechanism about how best to give effect to it, rather than a question of the substantive rules. But that will be the case I would make about that. This is about the how we're going to achieve the principles, rather than undermining or them in any way.
And you don't think the World Trade Organization will actually, any challenges will be successful, in that the UK is wanting to be both an autonomous trading nation and part of a as if in a customs union at the same time, and therefore is discriminating against those other WTO members?
Well, I think even with the EU's relationship, I think of Turkey and some of the accession countries that have had phased approaches into the European Union. There have been innovative steps along the way. What's different here is that we're looking for a phased exit, if you like, through the implementation period and then towards the end. And indeed, at the end, we're looking at a very innovative mechanism to make sure we maintain frictionless trade, but freed up to strike an independent free trade policy around the world. So, look,
but this is about the future relationship. This isn't just within the transition. This is a long-term proposal, the FCA, which involves basically the UK treating different WTO members differently.
Well, no, because I think the way that we will reconcile it is through the mechanisms, the tariff revenue formulas, and the tariff payment mechanism I described. But you're absolutely right to say this is an innovative mechanism. That has been part of the challenge, explaining how it works, also explaining the benefits. But we are going through an unprecedented set of challenges with Brexit, and I think it's right to come up with new ways of doing it. This is one of those, but I think it will be effective because it will reconcile those three key things that drive our objectives: frictionless trade with the EU, resolution of some of those challenges around the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and an independent trade policy.
Finally, you yourself have just mentioned phased implementation, and it mentions that in the white paper, which suggests that this is not going to be ready for the end of the transition period. So do you see the transition period being extended, and indeed if that was offered, would the UK government be likely to accept that?
No, I don't think so. We've got the implementation period. I think people want to see some finality to it, and we'll obviously try and marshal our administrative processes and our capabilities and institutional capacity to make sure we're in a position to give effect to the arrangements as soon as that they can be agreed.
But what if you're not ready at the end of the implementation period? I mean, we can't really afford to just go over a customs cliff at that point.
Well, obviously we'll avoid that happening. But I think the most important thing is getting the future relationship, once we've passed the point of negotiating on the withdrawal agreement and we've got the political declaration, I think the most important thing will be transposing that into a treaty as soon as reasonably possible. And I think you'll see Whitehall galvanise to help deliver that as soon as possible as well. And it will actually, Whitehall is a very technical and complex business. I've been on the civil service side and I've been on the ministerial side. But I think once you've got the end point agreed, the destination, actually Whitehall tends to welcome and rally to that strategic direction, and I'm confident it would again.
And you just last one, finishing off. You were saying obviously nothing's agreed until everything is agreed. Does that mean that you expect the full future relationship to be agreed before next March, so that we do get a withdrawal agreement and get the transition?
I think what we're looking at is a political declaration which, my predecessor used to describe it as, and I'm not sure I've got a better way of looking at describing it, as heads of terms for the agreement. But my view is we would like to be very clear on the choice of the relationship, and that it ought to look more like an instruction to the parties to get on and implement the model and effectively flesh out the detail, dot the I's, cross the T's, and crucially, we can't sign it formally with the EU until we're a third party. But I would like, my view is that we ought to be very clear on the choices that we're making, and otherwise I think there would be a lot of even more scrutiny than we would expect in this House if people thought we were signing up for a withdrawal agreement but with a nebulous and unclear destination point.
But surely we would lose the transition if we don't sign a withdrawal agreement.
I'm sorry?
Surely if we do not sign up to the withdrawal agreement as it's roughly looking, and with some kind of fudge on the Irish question, we then lose the transition period and we end up facing a deadline next March.
We will need to have the three elements in place by... We want to be in a position by the October Council. There may be a modicum of leeway, but that's the aim. And yes, you're right. We need all the bits of the bargain, the overarching bargain, which we described earlier in the session, in place.
Okay. Quick question. You mentioned, Secretary of State, your confidence in the talents of HMRC and the Foreign Office and its ability to innovate, and I'm reassured by that. But why are you not as confident in their ability to manage the much smaller issue of how to, for example, do behind the border management of different administration processes at the Irish border? Because after all, the wider border is of an order of magnitude more volume of transactions than across that small border area.
Well, so first of all, my point about innovation was in relation to not just Whitehall, but that the EU is at its best when it innovates. And I think actually, if I think of the evidence John Thompson's given on HMRC, I think you're probably right that actually the scale of the task could be manageable whichever the models that we chose. But the model that we've chosen, in terms of delivery, the model that we've chose reconciles the three key forks, if you like, of the strategic spearhead that we're putting, which is frictionless trade at the border, resolve the Northern Ireland issue, and allow us to have an independent trade policy. So I think it's more at the strategic level that we've chosen the model because of the strategic priorities that we've got. But I certainly accept the point you're making that the implementation issues are more challenging the more innovative your approach.
Right, please. Thank you, Chair. Some questions about manufacturing, and I hope you will agree that we have an appalling trade deficit on manufacturers with the rest of the EU. and that's something that has to be addressed. But with respect to manufactured goods, the white paper states that the common rule book would, and quotes, only cover those rules necessary to provide for frictionless trade at the border, and that, again in quotes, all rules that set the requirements for placing manufactured goods on the market, including those that set environmental requirements for products. Unlike for agri-food, it sounds very much as though effectively all rules applicable to EU manufactured goods will continue to apply. Wouldn't this be a serious constraint on us?
I think you need to draw a distinction between those rules that will go into the common rule book and those which are subject to different level playing field arrangements. They're set out very clearly in the white paper. I think we need to be very honest about this. In relation to the common rule book and the impact on independent trade policy, there is no doubt that the more flexibility and freedom of manoeuvre you've got, the greater your scope to offer concessions in free trade arrangements and negotiations. So there is certainly some pressure from that. Equally, I think the idea that the UK would junk swathes of its social protections or environmental protections is not very politically realistic. The crucial advantage we have in relation to manufactured goods will be that we can control the tariffs in relation, so you talk about, was it 10% on cars? So in our free trade negotiations with the growth markets of the future from Latin America to Asia, we would be able to, that would be something that would be negotiable. And that's, along with the flexibility we have around services, is, I think, the USP for the United Kingdom in terms of the free trade space.
I'm sure that the environmental requirements of products, that's something that we would agree mutually in any case. We wouldn't need to be told about it. But can you please identify for us the main types of EU rules that apply to manufactured goods which would not be part of the common rule book?
So I think the distinction that I wanted to draw is between those that are explained in the white paper in relation to where we would sign up to the common rule book subject to the parliamentary lock, and those which are wider areas of social policy where we would make level playing field commitments, whether they're non-regression or equivalents or whatever else they may be, but nonetheless where we retain far greater discretion and autonomy, and that's the distinction, I think, and it's set out quite clearly in the white paper, albeit at a technical level.
Could you not identify one or two types, in more specifically, one or two types of these e-rules which would not be part of the common rule?
Well, I think they're set out in the white paper, but if there are any that you would want to quibble with me on, feel free, and I'm happy to write to you.
The white paper promises, quotes, frictionless trade for the majority of UK goods trade. Why not all goods trade? What trade would encounter friction?
Well, our aim is to minimise the obstacles to trade. And sorry, I don't have the white paper in front of me. From which chapter and which paragraph are you citing?
I haven't got it in front of me either.
15.
Yeah. Paragraph 15, yes, please.
May I
please do.
on this, actually say that I think that reflects, Mr. Hopkins, that there are some goods today that for particular security and safety reasons are checked. And there are, of course, as one of your colleagues pointed out earlier, existing excise and security checks at the UK frontier today that do not derive specifically from a product standard. So I think the white paper is simply trying to be scrupulously accurate that the majority of goods would not need to be checked as they are today, but some goods are checked.
Just to conclude, really, when we first joined what was then the common market, we were broadly in balance on trade with the other member states, slight surplus perhaps. Since then, there's been a chasm open up, a trade deficit enormously to the advantage of Germany in particular. Doesn't being outside the EU after Brexit that will give us an opportunity to start to rebuild manufacturing, to make ourselves a proper manufacturing state once again, and to deal directly with this trade deficit?
I think we'll be a bit careful. I think some of the issues around the German trade surplus are also tied up in the configuration of the Eurozone and the wider EU rules and the way they work with the internal EU trade. But I certainly think it's right to say that we have an opportunity on leaving the EU to recast the economy. And I remember, much as it's been in the news for the different reasons, of Mervyn King making the point in relation to the referendum that leaving the EU would allow the economy, or create the opportunity at least of the economy to shift from a consumer spending paradigm to a manufacturing exporting paradigm. And so obviously there are competing considerations, and the FCA is an attempt to reconcile those competing considerations, but that is certainly one of the opportunities of Brexit, and I'm glad to hear it cited in this committee, because I don't think we should lose sight of the opportunities of Brexit alongside the undoubted risks as well.
I have to say that I think Mervyn King's views are very sound on all these matters, and I've read his words with great care. But the two things we've not said much about, one we've given away the pass, I think, and that is on aids, manufacturing aids, industrial aids. We've already said we're not going to expect any change in the relationship. We'd have the same constraints as the rest of the EU. The other thing, of course, is public procurement policies. Those are two areas where we could make quite substantial advantages if we approached it properly.
Well, I accept your point. You'll have seen the proposals in these areas in the white paper. They're subject to negotiation. But I do accept the premise of your question, which is in lots of these regulatory areas where we don't, because we've got a specific reason along the border, given the economy and the geography of the UK, the regulatory flexibility and the autonomy that we're seeking post Brexit will give us all sorts of opportunities whilst maintaining the kinds of social protections that I expect across the parties we all agree we want to preserve.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Now, Brian Davis on non-aggression.
Minister, there's obviously great concern that with Brexit there might be a reduction in environmental and worker standards below EU standards. So my understanding is now that the government agrees with the non-regression clause. So can you reassure us that there will be no diminution of environmental standards or workers' rights below those in the EU?
Yes, we've made it very clear, not just through the white paper proposals, but because of the effect of the EU Withdrawal Act now, the snapshot that we take of EU law. Of course, what we'll want to try and make sure is that we don't dilute any of those standards, we don't give succor to any of those who are saying there'll be some kind of bargain basement Britain. But we also have the opportunity for smart regulation and make sure that we configure regulation so it protects all those vital equities in the social sphere and the environmental sphere that you've mentioned, but it does in a way which is bespoke and effective for the United Kingdom. Now, some of these issues are global issues, of course, or have global standards, but the configuration of them in the UK will be very specific.
So we're clear. Clearly there's an undertaking that current standards will be maintained then. But what about future standards? So if the EU innovates and, for example, says that by 2030 all plastics will be universally recyclable, yet we're saying 2040, the EU is saying that all engines which are diesel or petrol, and new engines will be basically stopped by 2030, we're saying 2040. So, and what does it mean, the non-regression clause? Doesn't the non-regression clause mean we have to keep up with the Europeans, or will we lag behind?
The non-regression clause, its ordinary meaning, means you don't step back from the standards that you've got at the moment. And I think that's fairly well understood in the sector.
Right, so if the EU require much higher environmental and workers' and social standards in the future, and we don't match those, won't they accuse us of unfair competition in terms of, the environmental costs will be less, for instance, from manufacturing, as will enhanced workers' rights impact on costs?
Well, I'm not worried about what we might not be accused of in the future. What we've said on social employment protections is that we commit to high levels of protections through non-regression on domestic labour standards. And obviously, as we progress and we come up with different challenges, or we want to make sure we deal with different issues that arise, elected members of this House, myself, yourself, will be accountable for those decisions. I'm not quite sure precisely because I attach and you attach, even though we may have different perspectives about this, such high importance. Why would abdicate that decision for the future to the EU? Why would you do that if you think it's so important?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure answering the questions, but what I'd say is if you're going to agree now a non-regression clause that you sort of say, okay, we agree that we'll keep all the existing environmental and worker rights at the moment, but we won't for the future. And you might not agree to keep the environmental side. It might be the case that business say to you, we can't afford 4 weeks free holiday for everyone in the UK because the tariffs we're facing, and the government might want to cut workers' rights and environmental standards.
Yeah, so
you're saying that the future government will not have that flexibility, yeah?
It's very straightforward, Mr. Davies. We've said we will not step backwards, we will not go backwards in terms of the level of protections, but in terms of, for the future, we would have regulatory control over the new challenges, the new issues that may arise in the future, and I think it would be a dereliction of our responsibility as a government, or indeed members of Parliament in this House, to somehow give a blind commitment to follow the EU down a regulatory track without knowing what rules they would apply to or what issues they would raise.
But so there's no...
John, I think that's enough.
Okay.
Stephen Kerr, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State and Mr. Robbins. We've talked quite a lot about the Chequers deal, and the Chair referred to the interview that Mr. Barnier gave to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Secretary of State, you've described that as he was grumbling about certain bits of it, I think was the quote that you gave, and also that it's not the first time the UK and the EU have disagreed about something in terms of a negotiation. So the implication is you think that Mr. Barnier is just sabre rattling, really, and that this is a negotiation ploy. But I'm also a member of the Select Committee on exiting the EU, and we went to meet with Mr. Barnier on Monday. And I can tell you absolutely, unequivocally, without a shadow of a doubt, that Chequers is dead in the water. Mr. Barnier made it crystal clear that Chequers is completely unacceptable to the European Union. And he gave 2 reasons for that. At the heart of the Chequers proposals is obviously the facilitated customs arrangement and the rule books. And on the FCA, he said very clearly that it is unthinkable that the EU would delegate responsibility for collecting tariffs in the way that Dr. Whitford was interrogating earlier to a third country. It's not going to happen. And on the point of the rule book, he made it absolutely clear that 20 to 40% of the value of goods that are traded is in services in the modern economy with integrated supply chains. And so it would be unthinkable to potentially allow British businesses to have unfair competition if they are signed up to a common rule book in goods, but not in services. So what I just really did want to underline is I think your starting point needs to shift, and it needs to become that Chequers is dead in the water. Could you then outline what a plan B might be?
So first of all, I think it's great that the Select Committee went out there. Of course, in a negotiation, one side will try and resist certain aspects of it that they are uncomfortable with. I'm not sure why we would take it as read that means it's, in your words, Mr. Kinnock, dead in the water. And equally, I think you need to be more clear about the extent to which MPs in this House will quite naturally be used as a pressure exercise on the government. What we're clear about is that we've come up with, yes, an innovative and ambitious set of proposals, but ones that involve compromise on our side. And so, of course, we'll expect to see some compromise on the EU side. Now, just in relation to the goods services distinction, I'm going to ask Ollie to chip in here. I'm pretty sure that's a distinction that in relation to the EU's approach in other areas, actually they do follow or accept. But correct me if I'm wrong.
If I may, Mr. Kinnock,
Sure.
I would just like to supplement what the Secretary of State has said. And we're not accusing Mr. Barnier of sabre rattling. We're in a deep conversation with him about the proposals we've put forward, and he's advancing challenges and criticisms of those, and you'd expect that. So to tackle a couple of the ones that you've mentioned, the issue on the UK taking responsibility for the customs border to some extent on behalf of the European Union. This is, of course, exactly what the Commission has proposed in its protocol to the withdrawal agreement in respect of Northern Ireland. And so the question we are trying to tease out with the Commission is what is so very different about the arrangement that they have put forward in that context that is so impossible in the context that you described. And I think, as the Secretary of State mentioned earlier, there are other examples, for instance, in Turkey, where that's been deemed to be both legally and operationally doable. So the question is, what is the reassurance that both parties need that that can work effectively? The goods and services debate, as the Secretary of State has said, I think is in danger of becoming a bit confused. There are two issues that are raised here, if you don't mind me continuing for a second. One is about the extent to which, when a good is sold across the border, it comes these days often with a package of services, particularly complex, high-value goods. And how is it possible to regulate the good in such a way as it moves freely, but the, for instance, maintenance package or the financing package is not regulated in the same way? I think we have had a good discussion about that with the Commission, and I think the Commission would accept that that is the answer to that question is in how the EU chooses to regulate services in the future. There is no requirement for services to be regulated at the border. If the lift or the engine comes with a maintenance package and they want in future to regulate that maintenance package in a particular way, they will have the autonomy to do that, and it will be up to us to decide whether we want to do it in a similar way or a different way. The more complicated question, which I do respect but I think is being overblown, if I may say so, is about the extent to which, when that lift is sold across the border, some percentage of its value will have been the legal costs and the engineers' fees and the other services that went into the construction of the thing. Well, that's the case in CETA and in the EU-Japan trade deal and in every other trade deal that the EU is doing. So I am struggling to understand, honestly, why that is such a significant blockage to the proposition that we are putting forward.
Well, the point Mr. Barney made was that there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding on the British side of the way that the single market and the customs union work. And they are an ecosystem, is the word that he used. They are fundamentally and intrinsically linked. You cannot start to unpick regulatory alignment in the single market from the measures and acquis communautaire in terms of the customs union. So there seems to be a fundamental difference of opinion there about how the single market and the customs union actually work. We've got 42 days until the October summit. I don't know when you last had a conversation with Mr. Barnier, but I spoke with him on Monday, and he made it absolutely clear that this isn't going to work. So do you not think it would be responsible government to have a plan B in mind, assuming that we take Mr. Barnier at his word that this is dead in the water?
I think you're being drawn in too much to the pressure exercise that I described earlier. I think the EU is at its best.
A verbatim report of what he said.
Yeah, but in fairness, I've had 3 meetings with him in August alone. The last one for over half a day. I'm going back out this week, so I do understand firsthand what the EU's position is. Equally, he's made some very positive noises and remarks, most recently on the 27th of August, about wanting to offer Britain a partnership such as there has never been with any other third country. And I think that was interesting because it reflected a sense that we will do something innovative. And the EU can be innovative in the way that Olly's described, and CETA is an example of it. And of course, whilst we are very assiduously, and I've made a point of stepping up the amount of time and the regularity with which I engage with him, precisely for the reasons you mentioned. But the EU is not either one individual or the Commission. It's to use your words, the ecosystem as a whole. And from the Irish TSOC to the Latvian Foreign Minister to the Danish Finance Minister to the Polish Foreign Minister, we've had lots of positive feedback. But you're right to say, I think, that 2 things. First of all, that we are challenging some of the, if I can put it like that, the dry legal dogma that goes with some of aspects of the EU in some quarters. And secondly, I think beneath all of this, which in a way that you've actually faithfully conveyed, is there's a slight nervousness that the UK might rather do well and establish a competitive advantage on even the EU. And that ought to give people in this chamber and in the wider public a sense of confidence. But of course, it's something that the EU needs to be very mindful of. So what we're seeking to do is strive for an outcome which is good for them and good for us. We're not going to tie our hands from thriving when we leave the EU.
Just on the next sort of stage of that conversation, which was, he was then asked, well, given that Chequers is dead in the water, it seems that what you're saying to us is it's going to be some kind of CETA-based deal. And Barnier agreed with that. He basically said...
Can I just check? He said dead in the water. Are these your words or his?
It was all in French, so I can't give you the exact French solution. It will be all published. It was a public session, so I will be very happy to share.
I'm very happy to ask him whether he used the word dead in the water, but I just want to be clear whether it's your characterisation or whether you're saying he said it.
He said, les propositions sont mortes.
Okay.
Something like that. I don't think in the water was an Anglicism. But the key point is that he then said, well, we refer back to the models of the relationship that we think can work based on the British red lines. And if Chequers is not going to work from the EU's point of view, we go back to the red lines, then that leaves us with a CETA-based deal. But of course, it's CETA plus the backstop, as you've rightly pointed out. And CETA plus the backstop is not acceptable to the British government. So where does that leave us? So if we based again on the fact that the clock is ticking, we have 42 days until the October summit, but in reality there will be a preparatory process which will kick in at least 3 weeks before that. So I don't know what your estimate is of what you need to have on track for the October summit. I estimated at about 25 days. What are we going to do if Chequers, you're not able to sell Chequers to the EU, CETA plus a backstop doesn't work for the British government? What is the plan B?
We've been very clear. First of all, we're not going to roll over just because there is some traction static on what we think is not just a good deal for the UK, but a good deal for the EU. And equally, we've also made clear that if we don't see the ambition, the pragmatism, the energy that we are genuinely trying to bring to this negotiation to bridge the gap with our EU partners, then it's right to say we'll need to be prepared for the no-deal scenario. And that's why we've been patiently doing the work we have, both on the legislative front, the institutional front and the technical notices. But we are overridingly committed to the positive deal. We think our proposals set out a good framework. I don't accept the characterisation that you've put on it, Mr. Kinnock, but of course I'm not surprised in this negotiation there will be some pushback from either Michel Barnier or from other quarters of the Commission.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Very quick one from Marcus Fisher, then we must move on.
A quick series, Chair. Was an economic assessment, Mr. Robbins, presented to the Cabinet at Chequers of the different options between, for example, the CETA Plus and the no deal
I must, I'm afraid, preserve the confidentiality of the Cabinet process around this, as I tried to explain in response to earlier questions. Very thorough pieces of work on a variety of options were presented to ministers.
And was the economic work, was it updated since the Cross-Whitehall briefing in January?
I'm sorry, I think I must just refer you to the answer I've just given. I cannot breach the confidentiality of what was presented to Cabinet and how ministers then took that advice.
Has the government done any more economic assessment of the options since the Cross-Whitehall briefing?
So I think the government has committed that when it brings back a proposition to Parliament, that it will again then present its analysis.
Well, has it done any that you're aware of since then?
I promise I'm not trying to tell you anything other than what is normal practice here. The Government Economic Service is looking at a range of scenarios. It constantly updates the assumptions behind its analysis, and that is ongoing.
But you're not going to answer it. Will Mr. Raab answer it?
Yes, I mean, I don't know what happened. I can't vouch for what happened before, but we've made it very clear that there will be the economic analysis that as we go into the meaningful vote, and once we know the contours of the deal, that we will present.
So have you, Secretary of State, seen any updated economic analysis since the Cross-Whitehall briefing analysis?
Well, this is a iterative process, and even this week I've been involved in commissioning the work that we're doing on this. And of course, there are all sorts of data sources, some publicly available, others that we will require. So you can see some of those, whether it's Treasury, OBR, Bank of England, but there are also, I think, important specific sectoral areas that we will need to look at very carefully to make sure that we give Parliament as fuller but also as reliable picture as possible.
So have you seen any updated assessments of the non-tariff barrier numbers that were in the Cross-Whitehall briefing in January?
I didn't see the January one, so and no, I haven't seen an updated set.
Okay, I think that's it for the time being. Well, if you want to ask one more, but it's now 6 minutes past 4.
Right.
We're finishing at 4:30.
So am I right, though, in saying that that work hasn't then been updated since then, to your knowledge?
Well, I wasn't familiar with the original work because I wasn't in post at that time, so I'm not sure I can...
But it was leaked and it was part of the evidence to the committee.
Well, I don't comment.
So you have seen it.
I don't comment on leaks, Mr. Fish. But if you would like,
But my point, Chair, is that at Chequers a decision was made to adopt the Chequers proposal on the basis of an economic assessment that hadn't been updated since January, where the non-tariff barrier elements were incredibly controversial, massively overestimated.
I understand exactly.
Are you not concerned that Chequers was therefore adopted on a frankly incompetent basis?
Again, I can't talk to the decision making at the time because I wasn't there, and it wouldn't be credible or reliable to try and look back in hindsight in relation to a room where I wasn't present. But what I am happy to do is, on the specific question about the updating, is to follow up and to check. And
if you could do that and let us know, I think that's as far as we can go for the moment.
Can I just make one small suggestion? I know we're short for time, but actually that my private office will liaise with your clerks to make sure we've got a clear agreed list of the follow-up points, because I don't like to walk out.
And if there's anything further, for example, that Mr. Fish wants to ask, or any other member of the committee, we'll make quite sure that that gets to you and you can then reply in writing, okay?
Well, if you've got any fresh questions after this, I suspect
I'm sure we have.
You should write.
We will. On the question of the Court of Justice, the government's proposal regarding the ending of direct jurisdiction means that in practice it will fail to remove the very significant influence of this court, even when we don't even have a judge on that court itself. Now, you're very familiar as a lawyer yourself, as I am, with Martin Howe's work on all this, and I just wanted to get a sense from you as to whether or not you're happy with this situation, because the European Court, under Section 3 of the European Communities Act, is an obligation on us to accept their decisions, including constitutional assertions of supremacy over our constitutional arrangements, as with other member states. I just want to get from you a clear answer as to whether or not you feel that the fact that you're claiming that there won't be any direct jurisdiction really is a distinction without a difference, because in practice we're going to end up accepting the binding interpretation of the European Court's rules through the mechanisms that have been created.
No, I think it's a distinction with a fundamental difference in that it is true to say that where we agree cooperative arrangements or on citizens' rights, there is scope for references so that we have commonality of interpretation and consistency of interpretation. And I can think of lots of reasons for the British national interest why we'd want to maintain that. For example, on the common interpretation of the protections for citizens' rights. That is different in terms of clarity around points of interpretation from saying that the ECJ would have jurisdiction to decide disputes over the United Kingdom, and both in relation to the checks in place, so in relation to any references from the UK courts or the UK courts taking due regard of any case law, but also right the way across the arbitral mechanism, which we've described and is set out, the detail which is set out in the white paper very clearly. That distinction is held very clearly and firmly. And as I said to you before, I think it actually is a balanced, sensible approach. I think it takes care of all of the equities of those who've been concerned about the role of the European Court, whilst making sure we have sensible, practical approach to consistent rules where we choose to make sure that we're bound by them. And I mean, it has to be said that in terms of the overall scope of lawmaking and regulatory application in the UK, it would be a massive diminution in the scope of any CJU influence. So on that point, I respectfully disagree with Mr. Howe, and I think it is an important distinction.
Well, we'll follow this one up, so let's not flog it to death right now, but as far as I'm concerned, I think you're going to have quite a few further questions to answer on that later.
I look forward to it.
On the question of arbitration, deciding whether an EU rule is equivalent to a UK rule is going to require that rule to be interpreted as an EU rule. Will the EU side accept, from what you're hearing, that this can be done by the arbitration panel which you've settled on as your proposal?
Well, I need to be a bit careful about saying that the EU has signed up to things when we haven't formally yet agreed them. But what I can say is I think that what I've tried to convey as a balanced approach is something which we're making good progress on, and I'm confident that it not only respects the democratic prerogatives that you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to see return to this country, but also respects the autonomy of the EU order.
Okay. And on the question of explanatory memorandum, which are very much part of our scrutiny process, on the rule book changes which may be proposed by the EU, why can't you supply these to Parliament as soon as this is going to become a very contentious issue for us? The government is notified of it, in order to allow time for proper scrutiny and allow Parliament to give its views on the merits of the change at an early stage. I want a very clear answer to that, because we're going to follow this one right through.
If you can write to me or I can follow up, I'll give you a detailed answer. I'd need to check to make sure that my understanding, as I think it is accurate.
Okay. Now, on the parliamentary lock, it's really more apparent than real, isn't it? I mean, look, I've been on this committee 33 years. Never in that 33 years have I ever come across a single proposal that's come from the EU ever to be overturned either in a standing committee. It was once, actually, and that was a mistake by the whips. And basically, it just doesn't happen. So the idea that we've entered into international obligations and then we're going to have it offered to us that we are going to be able to have a veto, a parliamentary lock, is, to say the least, improbable in the light of existing past experience. It just has never happened. So what is this parliamentary lock? And by the way, the Prime Minister wrote a pamphlet, which I encourage you to read, in 2007, in which she said that she thought that basically the way in which the European scrutiny process in terms of parliamentary sovereignty was a fiction. And I think that she's going to be, as it were, hoist by her own petard on this one, if she persists in the idea that the parliamentary lock is actually going to be an effective one. If it really is a veto, and if we really are going to have the mechanisms and the whips are going to be told to get lost, and that they're not going to be allowed to tell members of committees that they can't make up their own minds about these things, and that we're going to have free votes on the floor of the House of Commons on all this, well, let me hear you say that, please.
Well, I think, first of all...
we get it, by the way.
What you're talking about has got to do with the scrutiny arrangements that this House has and whether they will need to be improved or innovated as we leave the EU based on the deal that we do, and also fundamentally on the decision-making process of individual members of Parliament. That's not a decision for the government, but that's really that's well,
that, if I may say, Secretary of State, you will know, is a pretty disingenuous remark, because for practical purposes, we've been through this for God knows how long. The bottom line is that when the whips decide on the instructions of the government to press on with something which is an international obligation, the threat of consequences, as it's put, are not just a threat of consequences in terms of the outcome as a matter of law or practice or policy. It's a threat of consequences for the members of Parliament if they don't do what they're damn well told.
Well, I certainly think it's correct to say that we want to make sure, I think in relation to parliamentary lock, there would be consequences if we did exercise it in a way which vetoed a rule book that we've signed up to. I think that rule book is relatively static.
It's all been decided by the EU behind closed doors. By 27 other member states, we're not even there. It's crazy.
Well, I thought this was a session where you'd ask questions and I would give answers.
Yeah, but I'm asking a question which is rhetorical, and I'm sure you can answer it.
Well, I'm happy to sit here silently and acquiesce in your rhetorical questions. But I think actually, if you look at since 2010, there have been a whole range of intense debates on the EU and scrutiny. I mean, as a backbencher, I voted against EU matters. So I think you're underestimating the will and the vim and vigour of MPs in this House. But of course, whips try and conduct the business in the usual way. I mean, that's what the separation of powers is all about.
Right, now Kelvin Hopkins.
Yes. Chair, with up to £40 billion being legally due to the EU under the withdrawal agreement, should that agreement not include very clear and explicit wording that that payment ceases if a future arrangements agreement in line with the political declaration is not secured in good time? Isn't that £40 billion a pretty good bargaining chip at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't want to describe it like that because we're in a negotiation, and I think there's a number of considerations here. We've got our strict legal obligations, and we're a country that pays our dues. But it's certainly true to say both that it's an important part of the certainty of the arrangements that the EU derives from this deal, and that's something that's very important to them. It's not just the quantum of the money, but it's the rate at which it's paid. I think there's often underappreciated that the regularity and the rate of payment is incredibly important to the EU. And it's true to say, as I've said before, that there's no deal until you've got the whole deal, and there needs to be some linkage, some conditionality. So, but I want to tread very carefully here because I'm confident we can get a good deal. And I want to go into that expecting A, willing on our side to comply with our obligations that we undertake, and B, confident that the other side will do the same. So I'm not going to go into a deal-making process expecting one side to welch.
Just quickly, I am aware that politicians in some of the recipient nations in the EU are demanding more money from the EU budget and are being told that there will be less money from the EU budget and they're going to be facing cuts. And a factor in that has been said to be the loss of the net UK contribution. So doesn't that put even more pressure on if they want to get extra cash? They'll have to be nice to us to get the 40 billion.
Perhaps, but one wouldn't want to crow about it.
I've quoted it. Thank you.
Okay, Richard Drax, please.
The 13.
Yeah.
Just before I ask on the 13, so can I just say that, just go back to the CETA Plus, if the one sticking point is the fallback, the fallback, whatever we call it, in Northern Ireland, and we have, as we've heard, conceded a lot in the negotiations, is it not time, and the Chequers deal we've heard is dead in the water, to use my colleague's expression, that may be the case or not, and everyone's saying the Chequers deal is flawed, is it not time for the United Kingdom to stand up and say enough is enough?
Well, I certainly, what I was trying to do in relation to the CETA Plus offer is be very clear on what the EU offer meant. There are all sorts of different possibilities that people can speculate on. And I do agree, Mr. Drax, with your depiction to this extent. I think we've made a very ambitious, innovative set of proposals that we've put forward to the EU. You can see that there's been compromise on our side. I'm sitting, giving evidence before you because it's been painful politically on our side. I think we need to make sure that we approach these negotiations in that spirit of goodwill and compromise. But it's absolutely right to say that now is a time for the EU to move and match the spirit of the ambition for the future, the pragmatism, and obviously the closer we get to the wire, people will get nervous about this, but I'm absolutely confident we can get there if that ambition and pragmatism is matched. And equally, as you know, we are preparing to make sure that whatever the outcome of the negotiations, the country is ready to not just manage the risks, and that will be important, we ought to be honest about that, but also go forward, seize the opportunities and take this country from strength to strength.
Good speech. If in time this deal is proven, even to you, Minister, that it's a non-starter, will you then have the courage to stand up and say, we must change TAC, CETA Plus, whatever it is, and get rid of this before we get dragged into a place that we just don't want to be?
Well, I think we're committed to the Chequers proposals. Yes, there are some challenges in the way that members on both sides of this committee have explained, particularly on the FCA and the Economic Partnership, but there's also been large areas of progress. And again, some of those were in the FAS interview that Michel Barnier gave. Obviously, people pick up on the negatives. Some of those have been itemised in relation to the press conference we had. And what I'm in the business of doing is building on the pluses and the issues that we've resolved and concluded, and whittling away at those areas of those outstanding bones of contention. So I'm going into this aiming for the optimum outcome, but as we've said, if we're not matched on our pragmatism, we are prepared for the no-deal scenario.
Can I move on to farming quickly, because I think time is short, and can I declare my rest of my members' interest, Chairman, in this regard? In evidence to us on the 18th of July, the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs agreed that publishing the rules falling within each of the baskets, harmonisation, equivalence and divergence, would assist the clarity of the debate and proposed in the White Paper. In a subsequent letter, he told us that this would not be possible due to the sensitivities of the negotiations. What can Parliament expect the Government to provide details of what rules it proposes to copy and what rules it proposes to seek equivalence with?
I'm not, partly because I'm not familiar with the exchanges that you're citing, and partly because of the DEFRA competence. I would need to come back to you on that.
Come back. And the next question, we had another one, I think.
Michel Barnier's comments following publication of the White Paper suggest that more detail has been provided to the Commission on what the UK envisages than to the UK Parliament and UK citizens. Is that true?
I'm sorry, can I understand the question again?
Michel Barnier's comments following publication of the White Paper suggest that more detail has been provided to the Commission on what the UK envisages than to the UK Parliament and UK citizens. Is that true?
Well, I wasn't the Secretary of State at the time of the Chequers decision-making process, but we have published all of the White Paper proposals, and obviously in the course of a negotiation we talk through and we answer questions that they ask, but I don't think there's been somehow more information in the European domain than in the UK domain, not least because of the scrutiny provided by this House, whether it's through select committees or the statements that we make to Parliament, I made one yesterday, or the countless debates that we've had.
Finally, how do you respond to his argument, and this Michel Barnier, that the EU cannot protect its consumers if the UK does not follow EU rules on GMOs and pesticides? Or again, do you want to write to us about that?
Sorry, they cannot protect their consumers?
If the UK does not follow EU rules on GMOs and pesticides.
I just don't accept the premise of the argument. But I don't want to take those comments out of context.
Well, we can resolve this one, I think, in correspondence, probably. I think it's also to do with Mr. Gove's own position, so maybe we could do it that way. I ought to say that we're running pretty short of time. I'd be grateful if you could just hang on a bit longer, because we've got 2 or 3 more questions. I appreciate the pressures on your time, but we are engaged in
Of course, stay on as long as you need, but we are... not least because I'm speaking to the 22 committee later.
Absolutely, and I'm sure you'll get there in good time. So, Andrew Lear, please.
One or 2 other things to do as well.
So, from the explanatory memorandum that has been submitted to us and from the White Paper on the future relationship, the government hasn't taken a decision on participating on nearly 30 different EU funding programmes under the multi-annual financial framework 21 to 27. Huge range of them, including things like, apparently you haven't decided whether you want to participate in the European Solidarity Corps or not. But there are others that are of slightly more convincing value, like Erasmus. So can you confirm that any such participation will come at an additional cost to the financial contribution already agreed as part of the withdrawal agreement?
The state of play is as set out in the white paper. If there are any specific areas of cooperation that we haven't covered there that you think are missing or that we should be thinking about, I'd be very happy to respond on if you feel free to write to me. And in terms of the financial settlement relates to the withdrawal agreement, but that's been agreed now. It's true to say that what we decide in relation to the future relationship will need to be looked at very carefully depending on the level of participation we want and obviously ultimately that the EU is willing to countenance.
So you've said several times today that this 40 billion is already agreed and that's sort of out of the way, but you've also said several times that you're involved in a negotiation and nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. So which is it? Is this 40 billion on the table as part of getting a deal, or is it already agreed that you're going to hand all that over and you're just hoping for a deal if the EU's feeling in a good mood?
No, it's certainly not that we're hoping that the EU will just be in a good mood, but obviously, for example, if we continue to take advantage as part of the future relationship, joint projects which have created an additional financial burden, then that would need to, that's not something that can be decided on that has been factored in, so that would need to be taken into account. But what you're talking about there is things where there's a clear UK national interest, and we would want to do so for all the reasons that he'll be familiar.
So given that the multi-financial financial agreement is coming close to negotiation in the EU and they need to agree that fairly soon, how soon are you going to have to be clear about which of these programmes you want to be part of, and how soon will everybody else, including those scrutinising you in Parliament, be aware of which you're interested in or not?
Well, by the time we do the deal.
By October/November?
Well, I've set out what I think the time frame is, but obviously I think we'll need to be very clear when we come to have the meaningful vote on all of those areas of agencies or regulatory cooperation where we want to participate and where we've got agreement on them.
Okay.
Good. Darren Jones, you want to ask two questions, one on internal security and then there was another one as well. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And in the 2 minutes remaining, may I move the debate to security issues, which, given the announcements of the Prime Minister today, are no doubt most important in our minds too. We have a Field Secretary of State for progress in terms of the withdrawal agreement and the trading relationship. Could you just give us a sense, perhaps in terms of a percentage of things that need to be agreed, how far we are in terms of getting agreement on the key components of the security partnership?
So we've made good progress in that regard, and I think if you looked at the press conference that Michel Barnier and I gave on Friday, you'll see in particular we talked about the progress in relation to PNR and PRUM data sharing and also extradition, which I know on all sides will be an area of interest. There's been broader cooperation in relation to the external security, and actually I think I quoted earlier from the FAS interview, that's an area where there's large convergence of agreement on at least the categories of cooperation that we want to have. And Michel Barnier also mentioned in his press conference the progress made and the increase in the offer that was made in relation to Galileo.
So in terms of 100% of the things that you want to agree, are you able to give us a feel how far down the track are we?
Do you know what, the original 80% on the withdrawal agreement, I think that was a term that the EU used and I think we agreed it. I'm not sure yet I would be able to give you a percentage on the future relationship, but what I could say is that on the security area we're in a good place. It's not as ambitious yet as I would like it to see. I think that there is a distinction in approach, and I don't say it with any criticism, but I think it's worth understanding this in terms of the dynamic of the negotiation. I think the EU does tend to look at the legalistic starting point. I think I look at this and the UK looks at it, and the Prime Minister has said that Europe's security is our security, is what is the level of operational security cooperation we've got? Why would we want to diminish that, and how can we make sure we retain as much of it as possible, because safety of citizens comes first?
So our police services, for example, have access to 32 law enforcement and national security kind of measures. How many of those have we signed off?
We're not looking at it in the because we'll be negotiating an arrangement which is as a third party. So that's a paradigm for a member state. But the areas where we've made most progress on data sharing, extradition, and we're also having, I think, a sensible and constructive conversation on those areas like Eurojust and Europol, where we want to maintain strong links. Quite what the formal mechanism is remains to be seen.
Maybe you could write to us on the detail of progress, because the police officers on the operational basis every day who use these 32 different measures will obviously want to know whether they can carry on using them or not. So for them, I think that's quite important. Just on the question of data, I declare my interests on the register on this particular point. How much progress have we made on, assumedly, an adequacy agreement on data sharing? Is that the intention, an adequacy agreement?
And that's a withdrawal agreement issue, and I think actually we're making good progress in that area.
So if the withdrawal agreement doesn't pass, there will be no agreement on data sharing?
Well, we'll go back into the no-deal scenario with the technical notices that apply, and we'll be saying more about that in due course in relation to that sector.
And there actually hasn't been a technical notice, has there, on the exchange of data? That wasn't in the initial batch.
We're a third of the way through the total batch.
And it was reported in the press that Europe said...
Total volume.
Sure. That from their perspective, there was no work should be started on the adequacy agreement, and I quote here, until the withdrawal agreement has been agreed and ratified, which makes it sound as if it's an issue for the implementation period. Is that right?
Sorry, are you talking about in relation to a deal or a no-deal scenario?
In terms of an adequacy agreement on data sharing. So no work on that.
In the deal scenario or the no-deal scenario?
In either.
So I think we'd want to make sure the arrangements were in place as soon as possible in the deal scenario, and as I said, we're making good progress. In the no-deal scenario, and it's not just true in this area, but across the board, one of the things that we've said as part of our technical notices, and I've written to the Commission about this, is there are some areas where we've got good collaboration about what good exchanges and about what level of cooperation we would do to mitigate the risks and the risks of short-term disruption. ECB, Bank of England working groups are one example of that, but we need to see that mainstreamed a bit more into other areas, and we've written to the Commission about that.
So we have started the negotiations on an adequacy agreement. We've just got to get through them, is that right?
Certainly in relation to the withdrawal agreement, the data protection issues, the way I described, are far advanced. And in fact, I think if you look, Michel Barnier referenced that in his press conference as well.
Okay, thank you, Minister. My last question is, all of this stuff, whether it's on security or trade or everything else, is clearly very complicated. And I and others have made the point that a question of whether we should remain on leave from the European Union perhaps doesn't give a clear mandate on how one ought to administer these points. Just a question, because it's something that I struggle with, that we learned before summer recess that this referendum campaign was fought on the basis of an illegal campaign. The Electoral Commission showed that rules were broken. Does it cause you any angst to be implementing these quite wide-ranging and potentially disastrous solutions on the basis of illegality?
No, I don't accept the premise of the question. Obviously,
you don't accept that there was a finding of illegality by the Electoral Commission? That's a question of fact.
Can I give you the answer before you jump in with the supplementary?
Yeah.
So obviously any impropriety in relation to campaign, and there have been allegations made on all sides, needs to be rigorously investigated by the Electoral Commission. That's their decision. But I think if what you're trying to do is to undermine the credibility of the referendum based on that, then no, I don't accept the premise of the question.
Because the fact is the Electoral Commission found there was a breach of the rules. And actually, if this was a general election, a local election, a European election, or indeed a referendum in a local council, this referendum decision could have been voided in the High Court. But those rules don't apply to national referenda. That's true, isn't it?
Well, you're complaining about the rules as they are, but we're following them, and we're going to give effect to the referendum because it was the decision of the British people. And I think, in fairness, notwithstanding the seriousness of any impropriety, I don't think any of that would have vitiated or invalidated the decision of the British people.
I appreciate you probably can't answer my question, but I will make the point that this is based entirely on an illegal campaign, and that just seems completely nonsensical to me. But thank you for answering my question.
You feel free to do your posturing, but I'm here to answer questions.
Right.
Last question, David Jones on a no-deal scenario.
Yes, just to pursue the issue of the no-deal scenario, I think, first of all, I'd like to understand what the government means by no deal. Your predecessor, in fact, said that the possibility of a complete no deal was, as he put it, off the scale improbable, and he said that even if the current negotiations were to break down completely, there would still be last-minute deals covering such issues as aviation, data sharing, maybe nuclear. So is it the government's position that no deal means walking away without any deals of any sort at all, or is a no-deal scenario one where you do cover these issues and maybe some other issues that need addressing?
I think it's a very good question, Mr. Jones. So, and I don't want to talk up the no-deal scenario because, as I repeat, the top priority, the overriding priority, is getting the deal. But I think it's true to say that in a no-deal scenario, there are various forms of collaboration that can and possibly should take place. Now, we, in our technical notices, set out the unilateral action that we will take to avoid, mitigate or manage risk. It is also true to say that we can take unilateral action in coordination with either EU institutions or indeed member states. So that would be one possibility. At the same time, there could be, theoretically at least, MOUs, or even, I think you referred to no-deal deals. We're not at that stage yet, but what and obviously we're spending the lion's share of our energy and efforts on our top priority. But we have written...
Sorry, your top priority being?
Securing the deal that we're confident that we will reach with the EU.
I'll have checkers.
Yes. So, but we have also been in touch with, in communication with the Commission to say, look, some of this collaboration as we get closer to the wire needs to take place because actually, come what may, out of the negotiations, we've got responsibility on to our businesses, to our citizens. So, of course, we can set out what we would do. The stuff which requires mutual agreement, even the no-deal scenario, requires agreement from the other side. But obviously, I think that some of the things that you've mentioned there would be perfectly sensible.
So just to clarify, are you in those discussions yet, or are you contemplating entering those discussions sometime soon?
There is already, and I gave the example of the ECB Bank of England Corporation, some engagement going on. But I think we will need to make sure that in other areas there is either cooperation or acquiescence in making sure that the no-deal planning can be done. Yes. I think it's the responsible thing to do, even if we're at pains to avoid it.
So Mr. Robbins, given that you've been there some time, what discussions have you been having with the European Commission about bilateral, so to speak, emergency?
Well, Mr. Jones, if I may just say, as a matter of propriety, actually Olly is focused on the negotiating track, and it's a different bit of the Commission that deals with most of the no-deal planning, and that would fall to me as Secretary of State.
If I may ask you then, are there officials dealing with the Commission on that basis?
Oh, we've got, through UC-REP and through our domestic officials, lines of communication. But as I've said, there are areas where, and there's a working group that the Bank of England has with the ECB, areas where that's quite, already that engagement is formalised, and there are areas where it needs to go further. So what I want to make sure, notwithstanding our focus on getting the deal, our confidence in getting the deal, is that we make sure we're ready for all eventualities. So yes, some of that needs to be stepped up.
And that would be incorporated into a formal agreement. Is that what you envisage? Should there be a no deal?
Well, I think I answered that in my earlier question, which is that, and we're not anywhere near that yet, but it could be done either through coordinated unilateral action,
yes.
It could theoretically be done through an MOU, or you could have some form of agreement as well. So all of those modes would be open. But ultimately, the ones that don't require unilateral action, that depend on mutual action, would require the EU to either acquiesce or cooperate.
Yes, that either have to cooperate or acquiesce, but it does seem to me that we're now at a point where we're only some 6 months and a bit away from exit day. And those discussions are at a fairly early stage. Would it be fair to say that?
I think if you're talking about discussions across the board, and not just between the EU institutions in the UK, but the member states and indeed, for example, port authorities. No, those discussions and those engagements have taken place. But it is true to say that in relation to the Commission, I've recently written to make sure that we're on both sides mindful of the need to prepare in collaboration and coordination.
And if the EU would not play ball, if they would not enter into those discussions, then clearly it would have to be unilateral arrangements by the United Kingdom. That's right, isn't it?
Well, it must be correct that if the EU don't want to sign an agreement or coordinate their activity, and that's what the technical notice is about. So there are different layers to it, and I think that's certainly correct.
Yes, and similarly, in that scenario, would you be relying upon the European Union unilaterally applying measures to deal with the to deal with the outcome of no deal?
Well, I think there's some areas where that may take place, but as I described to you earlier, as I see it, there are three modes of cooperation that could take place beyond the strictly unilateral action. One is action that we take on a coordinated way, but without any agreement. Secondly, action that we take based on an MOU, so not legally binding. And thirdly, you could have some form of more formal arrangement.
But as yet, you haven't in fact explored any of those eventualities with a view to arriving at any one of them, have you?
No, that's not correct, because as I mentioned, there is the engagement already between the ECB and the Bank of England. There is the range of action that we've taken, but it is certainly true to say that across the board, if we want to have the best mitigation in place, we would need the EU to be as forward leaning as we're willing to be.
You admitted that your focus is upon trying to deliver an agreement along the lines of Chequers. We know from Mr. Kinnock that Mr. Barnier thinks that Chequers is more than low. We know that several members of the Conservative Party, Parliamentary Conservative Party, from both Remain and Leave tendencies, think that Chequers is dead in the water. Why are you flogging this dead horse?
Well, this is a negotiation with the EU, so you're going to hear noises from various sides that are critical. That's natural.
Well, certainly you'll hear that from the European Union,
Mr. Jones,
but you're hearing it from your own party.
Mr. Jones, if you could do me the courtesy of replying to your question and listening to the answer in the way that I very carefully listened to your question, I'd be very grateful. So, of course, there have been noises since when you were a minister about this from both sides. I think that is an inherent part of a sensitive, contentious negotiation like this. But you should be in no doubt that we are making good progress, and we've had over 2 hours, I think it is, talking about some of those areas. There are, of course, outstanding points that need to be resolved, but we are committed to getting a good deal with the EU. And, of course, when we get close to the wire, you will hear noises both from the EU side and this side. I tend to think in a negotiation, I try to be very careful, that when one or other side go complaining to the media, then it's normally a sign that they may feel under a degree of pressure. And I'm certainly not going to take, with the greatest respect, Mr. Kinnock's word for what Michel Barnier said when I meet with him on a weekly basis.
I appreciate, if I may, Chairman, one final point. I appreciate that point so far as Mr. Barnier is concerned. But you have got several dozen of your parliamentary colleagues in the Conservative Party who've made it absolutely clear that they don't think that Chequers is a runner. You know that several of them will never support Chequers. So just to repeat the question, why are you flogging that dead horse?
Well, I want to be very respectful to the different views on all sides of this, not just in the Conservative Party, but across the wider House of Commons. I think we'll get down to a binary choice of whether we want the deal that's presented, and I think the proper moment to assess that is when we've got the package and when we can see very clearly what all these contentious issues mean in practice. And I'm confident we'll get there, and I'm confident we'll pass the vote, and I'm confident we'll leave the EU with a decent agreement, a good agreement with our EU partners.
Davis, one quick question.
Yes, talking of death, the Health Secretary has said that in the event of a no deal, pharmaceutical companies are required to stockpile medicines for 6 weeks. And in the case of insulin, we've got 1 million diabetics in Britain who rely on insulin, which has got a very short shelf life. So can you give a solemn undertaking today that in the event of a no deal, none of those diabetics will be denied insulin and face possible death?
Oh, Mr. Davies, I think that kind of scaremongering is actually beneath not just you individually, but this committee. But let me give you a factual answer. We've said in the case of medicines in our technical notice and the letter that the Secretary of State for DHSC wrote to the sector that they ought to consider building up a 6 weeks stockpile of medicines. And I appreciate that that's an important contingency plan that they'll need to take. But bear in mind, government is already partners with pharmaceutical suppliers who ensure we have 3 months' worth of buffer stock for over 200 medicines through the Emergency Medicines Buffer Stock Scheme. Public Health England already holds at least 3 months' supply of vaccines for the National Immunisation Programme. So yes, this is an important measure. There's a lead time for the sector in terms of putting it in place. But actually, it is, if you look at the scale of buffer stock that we retain in other areas, actually, yes, this is unusual circumstances, unprecedented circumstances, but it's not something that either government or the sector are unused to doing.
So finally, in the event of a no deal, if we do face risks, whether it's food or medicine or whatever, don't you think it's imperative that the public have a final say on the deal? Because there's a case for a vote on the deal, but if there's no deal at all, that isn't what Labour's voted for, certainly no sorts of chaos. So will you give an undertaking to lobby to give the people the final say on whether we accept the deal or no deal or staying in the EU?
No, I don't, and I think if the Labour Party had wanted to propose that, they should have tabled and passed an amendment to the Referendum Act when we had the debate. But actually, instead, all sides went into the referendum campaign agreeing that we should respect the verdict, not second-guess it. And I think both as a matter of principle, but also in terms of the practical implications for public trust in our democracy, what you're suggesting...
The diabetics didn't know they would be at risk.
What you're suggesting is rather dangerous in the way...
The huge risk we didn't know.
In exactly the way that the Shadow Trade Secretary described.
Great, that's enough. Kate, please.
Very quickly. When we went with the Northern Ireland Select Committee to meet Michel Barnier and so on, it's very clear that the Irish government is putting in huge resources to their kind of inverted commas whining and dining and all the kind of way that they do very well in terms of getting their message across. Are you satisfied that without a Northern Ireland Assembly and so on, that the Northern Ireland view in terms of the border and all the other issues are actually being pushed enough by our officials there? Because there is a worry that they are literally, walking hands over us in terms of the PR machine and the dealing with other EU countries.
Well, I've met with the Irish Foreign Secretary. I talked to key stakeholders and members of the political landscape in Northern Ireland. I'm not going to start commenting on the PR campaigns, but I think we understand the sensitivities on all sides of the community, and we're working very hard and assiduously to make sure that we're clearly communicating, and maybe you're right, maybe some of this needs to be better communicated, but clearly communicating as best we can the implications and also, critically, the advantages of our proposals for all communities in Northern Ireland, and indeed I think the communities on the side of the Republic.
Right. Okay.
No, do you think you'll be sending each other Christmas cards, you and Mr. Robbins? Christmas. No, Oliver Robbins and yourself. Were you exchanging Christmas cards?
I've got a good professional and personal relationship. I'm not sure whether it will go to Christmas cards, but that's because I send so few.
Just to go back to the first principles, which we touched on just now, Parliament, by a sovereign act of Parliament, passed an act in the House of Commons 6-1 to transfer the decision from Parliament to the British people. They made the decision. Is that where the government stands? And that's how we're going to remain as far as the question of a second referendum is concerned.
Absolutely.
Right. And could I just say thank you very much for coming. Has this turned out to be a holy grail or a poison chalice?
Oh, I'm not sure I would describe it in either way. It's a great challenge, but one we should rise to.
Thank you very much.